What I want to do in this hour is provide some type of overview of the time of the books that we're going to try to study together in the conference this weekend. I'll be going through Daniel, and Peter will be going through the second half, the hard part of Zechariah. Peter was also going to say some things about the nature and meaning of the Restoration era and of the latter days, but I think because this is a period of Bible history that is not much studied and that most of us don't know much about, and I've had to study a lot on my own, it's not going to hurt to go over it more than once, especially when we get into the historical details, which deal with historical events that we almost none of us have ever studied very much about. But the whole book of Daniel and a lot of Zechariah talk about these things. But they're not as familiar to us as Ahab and Jezebel or Samson and Joshua or Moses are. We don't know as much about Antiochus Epiphanes as we do about Moses, but he's a major character in these books. So without further ado, let me talk for a few minutes about the significance of the Restoration era. It's usually overlooked as a basic period of biblical history. If you look at books on the history of the Old Testament, the history of the covenant, usually they will talk about the Adamic period down to the flood, and then from Moses to Abraham, and then the period of the patriarchs, and then the period of the law from Moses to David, and from David then to the New Testament. Or it'll talk about David to the exile, and after the exile is just kind of a blank period. The Jews came back from exile and things were bad, and it was just kind of bad, and history was in suspension until Jesus came. You don't get the impression that there's any integrity or anything particular about this period of history. Well, as a matter of fact, there is. It clearly is a well-defined period in biblical history. It's not just after the exile. There are certain characteristics and qualities of this period that make it distinct and unique as a time of revelation. And God is revealing certain things about himself and certain things about humanity, certain things about history in this period that we need to come to grips with. One of the most important aspects of it is that it sets the stage for the New Testament period. When Jesus comes, he comes in this period. See? Moses comes in the end of the patriarchal era. And Moses deals with the patriarchal system and transforms it into the Sinaitic system. Moses, for instance, you see, comes and he says to the people, from now on, Aaron is going to be the priest. We're going to have this tabernacle here, and only Aaron can go up to the altar, and only Aaron can put an animal on the altar. You can kill the animal, you can skin the animal, you can cut the animal up, but only Aaron can put the animal on the altar. And all the Israelites say, whoa, wait a minute. Everybody can go up to an altar and put an animal on it. We've always offered our own sacrifices. We've always lit our own fire. We've always put our own animals on. And God says through Moses, nope, not anymore. We've got a special holy altar now. God has lit his own fire on it, and now we have to have a special priest to go up on the altar. And you can't come up on this altar. And as a matter of fact, now that God has lit his fire on this altar, you shouldn't have any of your own traditional altars anymore. So there's a big conflict. And Korah, Dathan, and Abiram come along and say, we want to do things the way Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did them. We want to go back to the days when every father had his own home altar, and everybody had his own altar, and everybody had his own animal, and lit his own fire, and all that. You see, Moses comes in that context and brings about a change. Well, Jesus comes in the context not of the Davidic covenant, because there's no Davidic king on the throne. And Jesus doesn't come in the context of the Mosaic covenant. He's not dealing with judges and the situation that was there in Samuel's day. Jesus comes into this period, at the end of this restoration or post-exilic period. And if we don't understand the qualities and characteristics of this time, we'll miss some of what the New Testament's talking about. We won't be totally a blank when it comes to reading the New Testament, but there are things that we won't understand. We get to the New Testament, everything's different. Jesus doesn't go around, for instance, condemning idolatry. He doesn't have to tear down any altars. He doesn't have to tear down any idols. He doesn't inveigh against the high places. Why? The history's changed. Something's happened in the interim. He doesn't deal with kings. We come to the Gospels, we find Gentile converts roaming all over the place that were not there in the Old Testament, at least not to the same extent. The nation is governed by a ruler sent by Rome, Pilate. That wasn't the case in the Old Testament. And there's some other symbolic shifts that take place in the Gospels that people don't often think about. For instance, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but the disciples that Jesus calls to serve him are not shepherds or herdsmen, they're fishermen. In the Old Testament, nobody was a fisherman. All of a sudden, the whole imagery shifts. Jesus calls fishermen. Well, I think that has to do with the fact that the sea represents the Gentiles, and we have a shift of emphasis here. But I think if we don't read the Gospels out of this context, we don't perceive this. So part of the value of studying the Restoration era is it's the context in which the New Testament comes. Second of all, this period is almost always overlooked as a separate covenant of biblical revelation. You get books on the covenants. You have the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and then the New covenant. And actually, in between, I would submit that there is a remnant covenant and a restoration covenant. The remnant covenant being set up by Elijah and Elisha and having different qualities and characteristics. Distinct historical break takes place at that time. The house of Ahab is wiped out, and both northern and southern Israel start over again with the kings. The kingly line, the Davidic line actually continues, but the whole Ahab side of it is wiped out. There's a definitive break that takes place, and another covenant arrangement comes in with Elijah and Elisha. And there are all kinds of covenant-making activities that take place at that time. Even more to the point, we have a lot of covenant activities that take place with the Restoration. And it is a new covenant. And we have a new temple. The new temple has different features. The temple of Solomon was different from the tabernacle of Moses, and the temple that Zechariah sees in a vision and that Zerubbabel builds is different from Solomon's temple. It doesn't have those two pillars, Yashin and Boaz, out in front of it because they represent king and priest, and there is no king anymore. So there's no need for a king pillar. There's a change in priesthood that takes place at this time. The genealogies of the priests that are there in Ezra and Nehemiah help to bring a focus to the narrowing and rechanneling of the priestly line that takes place. And Ezekiel specifically defines the priests as having to come from Zadok, and that becomes very important for this period, because the Zadokite priests are removed from office when the abomination of desolation is committed just before Antiochus Epiphanes, and they are never put back in office. And that's a big historical change. And the temple is desolated from the time of Antiochus to the time of Jesus, because there's no Zadokite priest. We'll discuss that quite a bit, because it's all over Daniel 11 and other places. There's a change in law and administration that takes place. We have governors ruling. The first governor that comes in to rule is Nehemiah. Nehemiah is sent by the world emperor to govern. Pilate is just Nehemiah's ancestor. Pilate is sent by the world emperor to govern the land of Palestine. This is the same structure that's taking place. There's a change in the populace. We had the Hebrews. The Hebrews merged with a mixed multitude in the wilderness and became what was called the children of Israel. The name Israel is used for them throughout most of the Old Testament period, but when they went into captivity, the 12 tribes went into Assyria. Some of those people came back, but all those 12 tribes are called Jews after the exile. Well, the English word Jew, English is unfortunate because we pronounce everything wrong. We say Abraham instead of Abraham, whereas almost all the other languages of the world, French and German and all the rest, they pronounce it Abram. You know, they say Isaac. We say Isaac, which doesn't sound like Hebrew at all. And we say Jew, whereas in German they say Juden. And when you hear Juden, you know that that's Judah. The word Jew is an English word that means Judahite, member of the tribe of Judah. And after the exile, all of them are called members of the tribe of Judah, even if they are from Asher or Naphtali or Benjamin or some other tribe. They're all called Jews, which means they're all positioned somehow or other into the tribe of Judah. And so there's a change of name that's given to them, and something of a change in the populace itself at that time. And Peter will talk about this some as we get into Zechariah, where it talks about the cities of Judah and the city of Jerusalem, and Judah and Jerusalem, and the covenant between them. And he's going to unravel all of those mysteries for us, and I'm looking forward to it, because it doesn't make a lick of sense to me when I read about it. But there are these changes in populace that take place, and changes of name. And this period is a new covenant in that it's initiated by prophets who reestablish the priesthood. And you'll get a summary of the night visions of Zechariah, I'm sure, and that's what is seen there, is God reestablishes the priesthood by cleansing Joshua the high priest, thereby cleansing the nation, cleansing the temple which represents the nation, and setting up the covenant. So it clearly is a new covenant. And second of all, it's important as a covenant because it sets the stage for the arrival of the new covenant. This is the covenant that's the immediate context of Jesus' work. And I'll give you one example of it. This is the one that's been broken. When Jesus brings his condemnation against the covenant, he comes to the temple, which is the heart of the covenant, and represents the covenant people, and he makes two charges. He says, my house is to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. You're swearing falsely. You claim to worship God, but your oaths and the words that you pledge to God are false words. And second of all, you're a den of thieves. And we look in this period and we find that they are constantly buying and selling the priesthood. The high priestly office is up for sale to the highest bidder. After the period of the abomination of desolation, it is a den of thieves. And second of all, they are not bearing proper witness before the nations, and so they're not a house of prayer for all nations. And so that's the nature of the covenant. That's what's broken. That's the condemnation of it. So this is a covenant. It's a new period. It's a new covenant. That's what we'll be looking at. I hope that those preliminary remarks have gotten you at least to grant the possibility that we're looking at a new covenant. And the whole week will fill out the details here. And if that's a new thought to you, I think that it'll make sense to you more and more as we come along. The second thing I'd like to talk about in talking about the Restoration era is its context. And to do that, I want us to think back to Genesis chapter 3, 4, and 6, where we find that in the beginning, God created the world, and he created three basic environments in the world. A place of worship, which is the Garden of Eden, a place of life, which is the land in which we would dwell, and then there's the outlying world. And we find that there are three falls of humanity that take place in those three environments. Adam rebels against God's authority in the garden in connection with the sacramental trees. He's told not to eat certain food, but on the Sabbath day, on the first day of the week, when he's supposed to get together with God and fellowship with God, he has already fellowshiped with Satan at a false meal, and so the Sabbath day, which should have been a day of blessing, becomes a day of judgment, and he is cast out of the garden. Then we follow that up right away with Cain and Abel, where we move from a God-man relationship to a brother-brother relationship, which is social and exists in the land. And the second area of concern is not liturgical concern, God to man, but it's a social concern, brother-brother concern in the land. And we find Cain murders Abel, and we find that Cain is driven from the land. And the final climax of this is we find then that Cain has descendants, Seth has descendants. Seth's descendants, being in the image and likeness of God, are called gods in the Bible. The word Elohim is used for men who are righteous in the Bible because we're supposed to be like God and show forth the image of God. And so the sons of the gods, or the sons of God, are the line of Seth. They commit the sin of intermarriage with the wicked line of Cain, and the result is the world is destroyed. They relate falsely to the outsiders. So we have a relationship directly to God, which is primarily a relationship to the Father. We have a relationship with our fellow man, or with those we're close to, which is primarily a relationship with God the brother. And then we have a relationship with those outside, which is primarily in the area of the work of the Holy Spirit. In Genesis 6 it says, "My spirit will not always wrestle with man," to try to prevent him from committing the sin of intermarriage. Well, if we follow out the book of Genesis, and I know this is old hat to some of you, but it's not to everybody, we find three pictures of righteousness in Genesis that complement these. Abraham, the focus of his story is on altars, places of worship. Abraham, the focus is on God the Father. Abraham himself is an image of the Father, but ultimately Abraham is inadequate as a father, because ultimately Abraham has to take his son and give him to the Father. And so God the Father says to Abram, "It's now time to offer up Isaac to me, and let me be the father," which is something all of us have to do when our children get to a certain age. We have to give them up and let God be their father. And that's part of the picture of what's happening there when Abram gives Isaac to the Father, because only God is adequate fully as a father. So the whole story reveals God as Father. It reveals what it means to serve God in the sanctuary, and Abraham does so faithfully. He stumbles a couple of times, but he's generally faithful. Unlike Adam. Abram was patient and waited. Adam was impatient. Then we come to the story of Jacob. Jacob wrestles with the brother. The Jacob-Esau story is the same as the Cain-Abel story. Esau is determined to kill Jacob. Jacob manages to avoid it. Jacob wrestles with a man all night long, and that man turns out to be God the brother, because Esau is not good enough to be a brother. And none of the other brothers that Jacob has ever encountered is good enough to be a brother. We need to have God as brother, and this story discloses that. And it shows righteousness in the land, true dominion over the land in Jacob's work. And finally we come to Joseph, and Joseph is set in a world setting. And Joseph is tempted to commit the sin of intermarriage, to commit adultery with the Egyptian woman, and he refuses. Later on, when he marries an Egyptian woman, the context makes it clear that she is the one coming to him and not vice versa. The Pharaoh is converted. Pharaoh's household is converted. They are rejoicing at everything that happens to God's people. It fulfills the Abrahamic promise, "Those who bless you I will bless." They can't do enough to bless Joseph and Jacob and his family. They want the blessing from God. These are righteous Gentiles at this stage in history. Because Joseph doesn't compromise, the Gentiles are converted to the true faith. Unlike the Sethites, who compromised and converted out of the true faith. You see, it goes the other way. So now we have, again, these three kinds of stages of history. Well, then if we look at the large phases of history from Sinai to Jesus, we see the same thing in much broader compass. From Moses to David, the emphasis is on the sanctuary. When Moses comes and he sets up the Sinaitic covenant, what does Moses set up? He does not set up a king. He sets up a priest. And I think this is obscure to us because we're used to thinking of Moses setting up the law, and that means Moses set up a theocracy. But the main thing that Moses as a prophet sets up is not a political theocracy. What the whole book of Leviticus is concerned with is the priest and the sanctuary. All of the last half of Exodus is concerned with is the description of the sanctuary and the priest. The man who is ordained and has God's oil come upon him is the priest. So what Moses sets up is the sanctuary, and that's the central concern in this period. And we find in this period that the Jews are continually departing from worshiping the true God, breaking the first commandment. They're not worshiping the true God. And eventually this period comes to an end because of the sins of the high priest. Eli fails to restrain his sons. His sons are stealing the food that God himself is supposed to eat, and this is a major issue in Daniel. We'll be coming back to this a bunch of times. But Eli and his sons commit the abomination of desolation, and God leaves. And that more or less brings that to a close, and we have this hiatus until the kingdom is set up. And then in the kingdom, the prophet Samuel comes, and he's another Moses. God calls to him, just as he called to Moses. And he establishes Samuel to bring judgment on the Pharaohs, which is the Philistines and also the bad Israelites at the time. And Samuel anoints the kings. So now we come to a period of the kingdom. Now we have a brother-brother relationship that's primary. Northern Israel versus southern Israel. And it's David's sons, not Aaron's sons, who are in view. Aaron's two sons brought strange fire before God and were killed at the beginning of the period. Eli's two sons blasphemed against God and were killed at the end of the period. Now we have David's sons. David's sons cause all kinds of trouble and almost wreck the kingdom. We come down to the end of this period, and the kings are bad, and the nation is brought into judgment. It's not the priests that are bad that bring the nation into judgment primarily in this period. It's the kings that are bad. Josiah tries to reform the kingdom, but he doesn't succeed. He's killed. Jehoiakim is bad. Jehoiachin is bad. Zedekiah is bad. And at the end, Zedekiah's two sons are killed. His sons, not two, are killed before his eyes, and he's blinded, just like Eli. So the same pattern takes place, only now we have this large phase being in the land. Well, we've moved from a sanctuary context with a priest to a land context. What's going to be next? What's next is a world context, the Joseph phase, where we are ministering in the world. And now you see the restoration period is not just after the exile. It's a whole new period of history. It's the Joseph phase, where now we're living in Egypt, and Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce us, but we mustn't get involved with that. We have to bear faithful witness, and when we do, the Egyptians will convert. So what happens in Daniel? They try to educate Daniel into the ways of the Babylonians, but he won't do it. Daniel bears faithful witness, and eventually Nebuchadnezzar is converted. What happens in Esther? Esther compromises. Esther doesn't tell him who she is. Mordecai says, conceal your identity. And things are going very bad for the Jews. They're about to be wiped out till Esther goes before the king and says, well, I am a Jew after all. And all of a sudden everything changes. She bears true witness, and things change. We find all the same elements in this passage. What is the big sin at the end of Ezra that Ezra has to deal with? They've intermarried with all these foreign women. And at the end of Nehemiah, Nehemiah has to deal with it. And Malachi has to prophesy concerning it. It's this problem of being in the world, witnessing in the world context. So again, I'm trying to get you to see that this period has integrity on its own and has distinctive qualities and characteristics that are relevant to us in the times in which we live. Well, another way of looking at the context of the Restoration era that we can build upon is that we have three testaments within the Old Testament that are written in connection with these three periods. The original Bible, which I call the Book of the Ox, and I get these from the faces of the cherubim. The ox is the priest. The ox is the servant. The ox in the sacrificial system represents the priest. And the ox is the only one of the four faces that's appropriate to the altar. Well, who wrote this Bible? What does it consist of? What is the original Bible? And where does it stop? Well, it's the 5 books of Moses and Joshua. At the end of Joshua, we're about 7 or 8, maybe 10, 15 years after the conquest, and that's the end of that history. And there's nothing that goes beyond it. And no one writes any Bible for several hundred years. The book of Judges isn't written till the times of Samuel, because it carries the history way forward, on up into Samuel's day, right on up to Saul's day. And obviously the other books are written then. So you have a period, we speak of the time between the Testaments when nothing was written. Well, this is the first time between the Testaments, between the ox and the lion testaments. And the end of this period, the sanctuary covenant is established. The books of Moses, whether they were partly begun by Adam and maintained by Abraham, or whether it was all written by Moses, or what source documents Moses used that have been written by Adam and Noah, I don't know. There's various hypotheses about that. But Moses and Joshua is the first Bible. And that's the Bible for several hundred years, the foundation Bible. It's the Book of the Ox. And the result of that Bible is it establishes the sanctuary covenant. Now the Aaronic sanctuary is set up, and history will operate in terms of that until it falls. After several hundred years, we have a New Testament that's added. The New Testament consists of Judges and Ruth and the book of Samuel, and then what are the other books that are produced right at the beginning of the period of the Kings and are done by the time of Solomon? Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. That's the second Bible. It's the Bible of the Kings, primarily focusing on wisdom literature. The first book primarily focused on law. The second book primarily focuses on wisdom, because it's a king's thing to have wisdom. And at the end of this book, the end of this second Bible, by the time it's finished by Solomon, the kingdom covenant's been established. And these books dovetail with the architecture of the time, by the way. The temple and the Song of Solomon go together. That's why the woman in the Song of Solomon is described in all this temple architecture language. These things all link together. That's the second book. And then you have another period in which nothing's written. You go from the time of Solomon down to well after the time of Elisha, and then the prophets begin to write. And we have the third book, the Book of the Eagle. And there is some debate as to who wrote the first book after Elisha set up the schools of the prophets, but the prophetic movement comes along. And Hosea or Joel or Obadiah or somebody was the first one of these writing prophets. Some of the books aren't dated precisely, so we don't know when they started up. And I didn't look it up to see all the ins and outs of it, but this much is clear. Sometime after Elisha, we had the first writing prophet. And it's completed by the end of Malachi and the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, which, let's get this out right now. Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. In our Bible, we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have Ezra and Nehemiah, but that's not the way it originally was. Ezra and Nehemiah is one literary unit. That's fairly standard. I've never seen that disputed. Maybe there are some who dispute that, but when you study them out, you need to study them as a unit. That's one book, and that with Malachi ends this Bible. And then we go for several more hundred years before the New Testament's written. Well, the Book of the Ox is heavily weighted with law. The Book of the Lion is heavily weighted with wisdom literature. The Book of the Eagle is heavily weighted with prophetic writings, with prophets. It includes Chronicles. It includes Kings. It includes Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And, of course, some Psalms and some Proverbs were added in. You see, some of the Proverbs were gathered up in Hezekiah's day. At least Psalm 137, which we'll use this week, was produced after the exile. But basically, it's prophetic literature. And what does it do? By the time this book is finished, by the time the Third Testament is finished, the Restoration Covenant is established. Nehemiah takes us down to the time when the city and the temple had been rebuilt and the covenant has been restored and the year of Jubilee has come. We'll see this, that it's the 50th year. Well, I don't know if we'll see it or not, but it's in your chronological charts in here. The 50th year after Cyrus's decree, the year of Jubilee comes there at the end of Nehemiah, and it's established. And now this imperial restoration covenant is set up. And now we move forward in the history of it until the coming of the New Covenant, which is New Testament, which is begun by Matthew and completed by the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the event that establishes the New Covenant in its finality. You see how this works. Now again, when you see this, you understand the Restoration era fits into a development of history here. It's set up by the prophets who start up during the Remnant Covenant and then bring in the Restoration Covenant and establish it as a distinct period of history. Now, I have a chart in your book. If you look back at it, it's the first page of notes in your notebook past all the order forms, and it basically gives a flow chart of history as I've come to see it. Basically, The first large period of history, the Adamic, Noachic, and Patriarchal covenants, focused primarily on revealing the Father. The Sinaitic and Kingdom and Remnant covenants primarily reveal the Son in the first phase of the Son's revelation, and then the Spirit reveals Him even more fully in this third period. And each of these starts with a prophetic time. God as prophet creates the world in Genesis 1, and then He sets up Adam as priest. And that's the Adamic covenant. And we find that Adam as priest blows it right away, but we still find that God's people are not given the right to exercise civil rule until Noah comes. With Noah, the state is set up. The right of capital punishment is given to the godly, but it's not given at that time. At the end of this period, Lamech is the prophet who initiates the coming of the new covenant. He prophesies concerning Noah, and Noah comes, and Noah is made king. Noah is given the right to put people to death. And so since he's a king, Noah drinks wine. Drinking wine is always something that the kings do in the Bible. Pharaoh is served wine by his cupbearer. Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king. The book of Proverbs says it's not for kings to drink much wine, but it's not for priests to drink wine at all. Priest is never allowed to drink wine on the job. In the book of Esther, the king is always having a ceremonial cup of wine when he issues his decrees, and we'll see this in Belshazzar's feast as well. The drinking of wine is ceremonially associated with kingship, and so all of those things start here with Noah. Well, at the Tower of Babel, this falls apart. So God comes and initiates a patriarchal period, which is basically prophetic in character. In a way, the prophetic time is a climax in human development, because we move from being a priest who is a servant to being a king who is administrator to being a prophet who actually brings a new world into being. The most godlike power that we have is the power to be a prophet and actually bring about historical change, to start up a new covenant. Kings don't do that. Priests don't do that. The priest is a servant, the king is a ruler, but a prophet actually changes history. And so Abraham and the patriarchs actually serve as prophets. In this period, we begin to see a shift from father to son, because it's always father-son relationships in this period. So this becomes prophetic of the next time in history. The Sinaitic covenant is priestly. We've already discussed that. Moses initiates it, sets up Aaron as priest. At the end of that time, there's a fall. Samuel is a prophet, and he sets up David as king. And there's the kingdom covenant. And in this we see the Son ruling over the land. As the kingdom covenant falls apart in the days of Ahab, Elijah comes and initiates a covenant and sets up Elisha as the prophet who has the second blessing, and Elisha restructures the nation. He sets up the schools of the prophets, he sets up synagogues, and he begins the writing prophets that then start the third phase. And the Holy Spirit begins to work, and messages go to the nations. Up till this time, God's been dealing with Israel. With the remnant, messages start to go to the nations. In fact, something very significant happens right at the beginning of this. God tells Elijah to go and anoint Hazael king of Syria. And Elisha goes and does it for Elijah. So this dealing directly with the nations begins to come now. And then we have Jonah going to Nineveh, and he converts the Assyrians. And for 3 generations, the Assyrians are converted, and then they apostatize. And Nahum writes a letter to the apostate Assyrians and says, "You've broken the covenant, now you're under judgment." But you've got 2 books there among the 12 minor prophets that deal with Assyria. Jonah converts them. After they apostatize, Nahum condemns them. And so we are definitely moving into dealing with the nations. And the Son begins to make a claim on the nations. The Son has been ruling Israel. Now the Son begins to claim the nations. Well, the remnant covenant, so to speak, comes to an end with the end of the kingdom, which it overlaps with. Zechariah, I think, is the primary prophetic initiator, and he sets up Jeshua as high priest. And notice the name Jeshua, which is the same as the name Jesus. This priestly period is the restoration covenant. It's the preliminary form of the new covenant. The Spirit is poured out in Zechariah. Zechariah sees 49 channels of oil coming from the Holy Spirit onto the people, onto the king, and onto the temple, and onto the people. This is the outpouring of the Spirit in its first form, and to enable Israel to conduct her priestly ministry in the world. They apostatized from this ministry in the days just before Antiochus Epiphanes, as we'll see. And after a century or so, John the Baptist comes as a prophetic initiator to set up Jesus and anoint him as king. Jeshua becomes king, and the Spirit is poured out in his fullness, and the king rules over all the nations. So we move from a family time in the age of the Father to the national time in the age of the Son's rule over Israel, to this international time, or cosmic time, when the Son, through the Holy Spirit, rules over the entire world. Now you can look at that chart in more detail, study it, see if it really fits. But here again, I offer this as giving a context for where the restoration covenant fits. It is a priestly time. It's initiated by a prophetic time. In the remnant, the prophets come and set it up. They set up a priestly period where Israel is once again priests to the nations. And they're all priests. And the whole city of Jerusalem is a holy city. The whole place is like a temple. And the emphasis is on their priestly work to the nations. So that's one of the characteristics of the restoration covenant, or restoration period. What are some of the characteristics of the restoration or covenant era? First of all, although every covenant is set up by a prophet, the Restoration Testament is heavily weighted with prophetic writings. I've already mentioned this. There's a sense in which being a prophet is the climax of human maturation. As we mature, we grow from being a child and being a servant and being an apprentice when we are old enough to start to work, to being an administrator, and that's what it means to be a king. But the king is always supposed to listen to the prophet. And finally, the greatest maturation is to be an elder, or to be a prophet, who actually, by your teaching and instruction, you change and create a new future. That's the amazing power here. King does not create a new future. The king maintains the kingdom where it is. But the prophet comes, and by his words, and words are powerful, by his words he creates a future. Let me give you an example. At the end of the Roman Empire, Augustine, after many years of serving in the church, wrote a book called Concerning the City of God. That book created a civilization. It created the early Middle Ages. At the time of the Protestant Reformation, after one generation of service and study, a man who was almost a second-generation reformer wrote a book that created the modern Protestant world. And that's John Calvin. He wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which created the modern Western world. It created the United States. It created England. It created modern French. My father was a French professor, and he said Calvin's Institutes is the first book of modern French. Calvin's French is modern French. You go back before Calvin or with Calvin's contemporaries, you have to study late medieval French. But Calvin was read by everybody, and his French became modern French. Now that's a prophetic act to create the future by your words. Seek to do that with our children. Elders seek to do that in the church by teaching and preaching. But when you get the largest form of that is that God as prophet creates the world, speaks it into existence, and we as we mature and become more godlike, as we mature in godlikeness, then we become more like prophets, and God allows us to have a hand in creating the future. And we can create a bad future too. But in terms of the Bible, this prophetic period is this. And the emphasis on the prophetic here throws us toward the new covenant. The remnant covenant and all those prophets bring in the final covenant. They bring in the latter days. They bring in the new covenant. And the new covenant comes in its preliminary form after the exile.
And then it comes in its fullness with Jesus Christ. But the entire prophetic time, what's happening is God creates the world to start with, and God creates man, and He allows humanity to grow up to the point where now God and man together bring the Messiah. And Jesus is God and man. So the human prophets have a hand under God, with His Spirit working with them, in bringing to pass this new phase of history. And this new phase of history doesn't come until we have human prophets who are able to join in doing it. And that's part of, I think, what it means that Jesus is God and man. And that He is brought into being by the church of the Old Covenant, matures to that point. So the prophets join with God in calling the Messiah into history. And so all the prophets, starting in time after Elisha, they point forward to the coming of the Messiah and of the new covenant, the final covenant. So that's one aspect, characteristic of the Restoration era, is that it's heavily weighted with prophetic writings in bringing it into being. Second of all, the time of the Restoration era itself is a time of priestly service to the world. It comes after these prophets set it up. And it is the beginning of the latter days. And I've got a little chart here. The former days has two phases. The priestly phase in the land from Moses to Eli, whose sins, and then to Saul and David. In the kingly period in the land from David to Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have in the latter days the priestly period from the prophets who set it up, like Moses, to Menelaus, who commits the abomination of desolation, like Eli. And then from there to Herod, who is a new Saul, and then Jesus, who is a new David. Herod is king of the Jews. Jesus is king of the Jews. The kingly period in the world goes from Jesus until Jesus yields the kingdom to the Father at the end. So that's the structure. Former days and the latter days, in the land and in the world. A third characteristic of the Restoration era is that Israel will be ruled by world emperors through their governors, the apostles. The word apostle means an ambassador who's sent out by somebody else. And this is the beginning of that apostolic idea. Nehemiah is an apostle from Darius Artaxerxes to Jerusalem. Pilate is an apostle from Rome to Judea. Then Paul becomes an apostle from the world emperor, Jesus Christ, to various churches. You see, Jesus becomes not just the great new Aaron and priest, and not just a new David king, he also becomes the new Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Darius, world emperor. And so he sends governors, he sends ambassadors. And in a sense, Paul and the apostles are filling out, in part they fill out a lot of other positions as well, but one of the positions they fill out is the position that Nehemiah and Pilate have as apostles or governors sent by the high king to administer the kingdom on their behalf. And during this period, the Davidic kingship goes underground. What happened to those Davidic kings? Well, you get into Zechariah and you find we have a Davidic king. We have Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the king. And there they are side by side. And the two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, are there side by side, and they anoint them. And Zerubbabel builds the temple, and Zechariah chapter 4 talks about how Zerubbabel is going to get the temple built, and then all of a sudden, poof, he disappears. What happens? Well, what happens in Zechariah 6 is that the crown, which might be Zerubbabel's crown and would have been, is put on the head of Joshua the high priest. And so the priests hold the kingship in trust. Comes. You see. The crown is put on Joshua's head, and the priests hold the kingship in trust until Jesus comes. And we don't have kings. The genealogy continues, and the Gospels give us a genealogy of Jesus back through the Davidic line, but none of those people ever served as rulers and governors in Israel. It's the high priests who were rulers and governors in Israel throughout this period. Finally, another last characteristic I'm going to talk about here of the Restoration era is the challenge of the Restoration and of the latter days, and what's happening here and one of the shifts in history that takes place. And I may come back to this some, and this is a little bit philosophical, but I won't throw it out, put it on the table. What's happened is that the kingdom has fallen. Well, let me give you an example, first of all. Gary North was talking to a friend of his who was from the Netherlands, Dutch fellow, years ago, and he said, how come all Dutch Calvinists are amills? He says, are there any Dutch Calvinists that are post-mills? He says, once upon a time, Dutch Calvinism was post-millennial. The Puritan Dutchmen were post-mills. What happened? What happened to the days of Coxius and Petringa and all these other guys who were post-mills? And he said, well, you got to understand, once upon a time the Netherlands had a great empire. And then the English defeated it. And ever since that time, we've been on mills. That happens again. I did a study on Southern Presbyterian millennial views that I still sell, and once upon a time, Southern Presbyterian Church were all post-mills. And then, along came the war to free the slaves. I mean, the war of northern aggression. Whatever you want to call it. And the South lost, and after that time, they were all pre-mills and non-mills. Mostly. Now, that's real. And what happens is, it happens to us as individuals, it happens in culture as well, kingdom is fallen, and the tendency is to give up and say, I don't really care anymore, there's no more future, there's no more history, we're not going to try anymore. If you do that in your own life, or if that idea becomes pervasive in society, it produces stoicism, and it produces homosexuality. The I don't care, I'm not going to try anymore attitude is essentially, at root, it's the same thing that homosexuality is. If you're around homosexuals, you know that they have this thin smear of superiority about everything because they're not committed to anything. They don't commit to each other. I mean, the idea that homosexual men are going to get married to one another and stay faithful year after year, that's extremely rare. That is not their lifestyle. They don't commit to anything. They're above everything and estranged a little bit from everything. That's what Stoicism is. I'm not going to get involved anymore because I got hurt once, so it's not going to happen anymore. Now, this big temptation that comes to people in middle age, comes to men in middle age. You get to about 40, 45, and you realize, as I have, and others my age who have midlife crisis realize, you're not going to accomplish all the things you once thought you were going to accomplish. And you're not going to do all the things you once thought you were going to do. And so then you have, this initial part of life enthusiasm that was part of your life goes away. Now you have a choice. Am I going to say, well, I just don't care anymore? I know I'm preaching, but this is important because I think it plays into this history. I don't care anymore. I'm not going to try anymore. That's the temptation that comes. It comes to men and women. You have to wrestle with it. God says you mustn't do that. Now, the whole world was at this point at this time because Israel's history is the core of world history, and the collapse of the nation of Israel brought this temptation to them, but the same thing had happened in the whole world. And so at this time, Greece comes up with the alternative. Greek philosophy, which arises at this same time, is the opposite of biblical prophecy, and it's the foil of biblical prophecy. Philosophy is essentially homosexual, and it's essentially stoic. It's separated from life, and it's unfeeling. It is the opposite of prophecy, and it's still very much with us. Our idea of an intellectual is somebody who's not moved. A person with a philosophical attitude on life is somebody who is unflappable, who doesn't get emotionally upset. He sure isn't like David, who is screaming and crying out to God in the Psalms. He sure isn't like Jesus, who's yelling and screaming at the Pharisees. He's not clapping his hands, and he's not stomping his feet. He's Presbyterian. You see, there's a lot of that in all of us. It's still there. Peter wrote his whole master's thesis on the subtle influence of this way of thinking in the thought of John Calvin. It's there in our tradition. That's not the main thing in our tradition, but it's there. It influences us. It's not completely gone. But at this stage in history, the Greeks arise in Greece with philosophy, and in Israel, the prophets come with prophecy. Both come up now. Then neither one was really there before. Before that time, you had the kingdom of Israel, and you had these other kingdoms. You had Assyria, you had Syria, you had Tyre, you had Babylonia. And those kingdoms had a certain kingdom pattern. They had temples, they had a ritual, they had their god. It was a counterfeit of Israel. Now we have another period of history, prophetic period, where God says, you need to get back involved in the world even though it hurts. You have to make a decision now. You're not enthusiastic anymore. You've already lost once. Now you're just going to have to make a decision of the will to get back involved in life. And at exactly that time, Greek philosophy comes along with the opposite approach that says stand back and just observe everything. Be an observer, not someone who's involved. Prophecy calls for a re-engagement with life even if it hurts. And you see, you move from the former days to the latter days because you have learned something. You've learned that being involved in the world is painful, and so now you don't want to be involved in the world anymore if you're a Christian. And so you have to make a decision. The restoration, then, is a call to witness in the world. And it's a more mature call because we now know that witness can be painful. God promises, and this is a theme in Daniel, and it's why Daniel keeps being distressed by the visions that he sees, I think. God promises that persecution will be the initial result, and the victory will not come immediately. Thus the call is to mature decision-making. Deuteronomy 28 still applies, but it applies in a more sophisticated manner. God said to Israel in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, if you obey me, you'll get rich. You'll be the head and not the tail, and your enemies will all flee away. Now God comes to Daniel and he says, if you obey, you're going to get thrown in the lion's den. And you're going to get thrown into a fiery furnace. And there's going to be persecution and tribulation, but eventually the Ancient of Days will give the kingdom to the saints of the Most High. But, first of all, it's going to be real hard. Now, it takes more maturity to say, okay, I'm going to obey anyway, even though it's going to be painful to start with, because what's eventually going to happen for my grandchildren is better. You have to have more maturity to make that decision. And so we're moving from a more childlike treatment to a more adult treatment, and I think it's important to understand that. Those of us that believe strongly in the applicability of all the Word of God, we don't want to take Deuteronomy 28 and those passages out of context and say that they mean for us exactly what they meant for Israel, because I think they had a more direct meaning for Israel. I think God was saying to them, if you obey me, I'll bless you right away. And he's saying to us, you've got a whole lot more history behind you. You know more. If you obey, there may be tribulation first, and then we'll see if you persevere. So we have actually three phases of history. We're back to it again. The opposition of God's tribes to human tribes in the Mosaic era. That was the age of tribalism. The characteristics of tribes are what's important for that era. The opposition of God's kingdom to human kingdoms in the Davidic era. That was the age of kingdom. And now comes the opposition of prophecy to philosophy, the opposition of Torah to Hellenization. And the temptation to Hellenization is the temptation of this period. What happens in Daniel 11, that long, confusing chapter? In the age of Greece, what happens? What happens is the Jews start wanting to become like Greeks. And so the high priest, the godly high priest named Onias III, stands against the Hellenizers, but his relative, Jason, who changes his name from Joshua to Jason, wants to be like a Greek. And so he gets Onias kicked out and driven into exile, and then he sets up gladiatorial games in Jerusalem. And they all start becoming Greeks. He sets up a gymnasium. They bring in an Athenian philosopher to teach philosophy in the city of Jerusalem. And Jason sends money to Antiochus IV to buy the high priesthood. That's the sin. It's the Jews apostatizing into Hellenization. And of course, since these Olympic Games, the games were conducted by men stark naked, and the Jews were circumcised, they didn't want to be ridiculed, so they went to the trouble to have foreskins sewed back on themselves so that they would not be ridiculed. Now, if you're willing to go through that much pain, you are very anxious to be Hellenized. Frankly, the carrot just doesn't look all that tasty to me. But they were willing to go through that much pain and agony in order to pass themselves off as Greeks. Well, of course, what happened next was Menelaus, whose original name was Menachem, but he didn't want that Jewish name. He took the Greek name Menelaus, who was not of the high priestly line. He sent money to Antiochus, and he bought the high priesthood from Jason. And when Onias rebuked him, Menelaus had Onias killed, murdered the true high priest, and that, I would say, is the apostasy that takes place. It's the desecrating sacrilege that then, once that happens, God sends in Antiochus Epiphanes to persecute the Jews and to tear up the temple for a few years to teach them a lesson. But that's the great temptation, Hellenization. And after that time, the Jews never really repent. The Sadducees were the great Hellenizers, and the Sadducees controlled the high priesthood from that time on. And as we'll see, this is really the Protestant age of the church. They don't have idols, they don't have images in their church. They had denominations. They have your four basic Protestant denominations in this period of history. You have your liberals, they're the Sadducees. You have your evangelicals, and they're the Pharisees. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees had become kind of legalistic, but see, they're the ones Jesus deals with because they're the only Bible believers who are faithful. So Jesus works with them. Then you have the Anabaptists who drop out. They're the Essenes. And then you have the radicals who are the Zealots, who are politically minded. They're the Maccabees, and then later on the Zealots. And those are your four groups. We have them today. We have liberals. We have increasingly now zealot, radical pro-life types who think about fighting the government all the time. We have evangelicals, and we have dropout types. You always have those tendencies. And those are the four denominations that show up now in this period. And we're in a similar period now, you see. We have been for the last several hundred years, an age of witnessing, an age of conflict over philosophy. So our age is a lot like the Restoration Covenant age. Maybe we can talk about that some more. But those are some of the chief characteristics of the time. Now, what I was going to do next, and probably should do to get this out on the table and done with, is give a quick survey of the Restoration period. Obviously, since that's what we're studying this week, we're going to be going over this history more than once. But because it's strange and unfamiliar, we should probably lay it out. But does anybody want to make any comments or raise anything about what I've said so far? Unclear.
What age do you think we're in now? Tribalism?
No, I think we are at the end of an international time, Protestant time, a Restoration era type time. We're about to move into a tribalistic time, a priestly time, and so the church has got to be restored. But the church has basically functioned without icons as it did during the Middle Ages, and basically, well, like the synagogue, like this period of history here. Study, and the issues have been Hellenization. Do we go with modern philosophy? Liberalism versus conservative orthodoxy in the Protestant world. And it's been an age of witnessing, just as the Restoration era was an age of witnessing, and the Jews traveled all over the ancient world and made converts, and you find all these Gentile converts showing up in the New Testament because of this age of witnessing. The Protestants have done that. But eventually the international consensus breaks up, and I think we're breaking it up now. But I do think that the typology or characteristics of this time have a lot to do with the time that we've been in as the Western world.
How many times was the temple destroyed? Any other times besides that?
Well, the temple was destroyed first in Nebuchadnezzar's day. Then it was torn up by Antiochus, and then Herod's temple is torn up in AD 70. But in terms of that history, those are the only times.
I've heard different debates over whether or not that the Herod's temple was a dispensation referred to the temple being restored and so forth.
Yeah.
But then others have said there's no, but nothing in the Bible about a third temple. So there must be, maybe they meant this temple or whatever it is. That's what I'm trying to ascertain, how many times the temple was destroyed.
It depends on how you count. The actual physical destruction of the temple twice. The temple itself, as a physical structure, was burned down and destroyed twice.
Because Herod, referred to the temple of Herod, did he merely improve it?
Yeah. Herod's temple was an improvement of the Zerubbabel temple.
Your philosophy about how to try to find out stuff like Protestant that you left out until the city and building.
Well, I think that the history of the New Covenant is more complex than this, so there's overlap. But even in Protestant countries, Roman Catholics tend to be somewhat Protestantized. If you compare Catholicism in this country with Catholicism in Bolivia, you know, there's a good deal less superstition and magic among Catholics in a Protestant land than there is in a Catholic land. John?
Suggest that these things sort of structure historical cycles. Is that would you speculate that, or
Yeah, I don't call them cycles, but spirals. But yeah,
even now in this new covenant, which is sort of the definitive epic of history as far as the administration of God's kingdom is concerned, but you would still see these spirals.
yeah. What we think of as the early church is basically priestly time when the church was set up. The medieval time was basically a kingly time when the nation states were set up.
Then there would be, I think I've seen certain graphs and other things, you know, they are sort of spiraling upwards. In other words, there's no way to go back and duplicate, you know, the early church. There's a lot of people who think there's a great deal of society just going back to doing the way they did it in the first century.
Yeah.
If that was comparable.
No, we're not supposed to. We're supposed to grow up. I think that the church is maturing, and the early church is really the infant church in a lot of ways.
But even if you're right, and even if these cycles do in some way roughly apply or can be extrapolated as having some, if they are some sort of paradigm for history, even if we entered into another priestly cycle, as you say, it would be a more mature priestly cycle.
That's right.
Than the previous.
Right. In fact, you see that here in the history of Israel. The first priestly time with Aaron, their priests in the land. The second priestly time, they serve as priests in the world.
So this thing of the restoration is always neglected, and it's always seen as sort of biblical dark ages.
Yeah.
But it's actually the prophecies are backed up and aligned, and that it's supposed to be a more glorious time than that.
Yeah, I think that the Church of Philadelphia draws imagery from this time, and the beginning of this period is a time of an open door. And there's tremendous advance for the kingdom of God at the beginning of this period, and then the apostasy comes in the days of Jason and Menelaus. Let's take the last few minutes here and briefly summarize the history of this period. That'll just be the first time through some of this that obviously we'll be coming back to. I've got it in 5 historical phases. First, the time of the remnant covenant. Elijah is a prophet who sets it up. He sets up Elisha and the schools of the prophets. This period, I think, is really marked by the fall of the house of Ahab. A lot of attention is paid to these things in Kings. They're the heart of the book of Kings. There's this transition from before to after what Elijah and Elisha do in the destruction of the house of Ahab. We see the rise of the writing prophets, the fall of Israel, that's northern Israel, and in Judah then we have what's important for the history of the sins of Manasseh. And the Jews allowed, the southern Israelites, the Judahites, allowed Manasseh, who ruled for 55 years, to lead them into horrible sins and idolatry. And Manasseh repented at the end of his life, and after him came Josiah, and you have kind of an Indian summer in Judah's history. Josiah tries to bring about some reforms, but they don't really take, and Jeremiah preaches during Josiah's time. In fact, Jeremiah preaches for exactly 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah's preaching is a 40-year period that leads down to the destruction of Jerusalem and then beyond it. But it's kind of interesting numerological type in that, in what he does. Josiah's reforms do not really penetrate, and then God turns the world over to Babylon, and we find that the world is going to be given to Babylon for 70 years. Now, when do those years start? I believe that the years start with the first year of Jehoiakim, which comes after Josiah's death. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, in Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah says, "This is Nebuchadnezzar's first year, and God has given the world into Babylon's hands for 70 years. And so most people date the 70 years from that time. It doesn't say the 70 years start then. And actually, if you look at the 70 years and count them back from Cyrus, they start with the first year of Jehoiakim after Josiah's death, which makes sense. In the third year of Jehoiakim, Prince Nebuchadnezzar is not king yet, takes Jerusalem, and he takes Daniel home. Very shortly after that, his father dies, and he becomes king. That's in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. In the fifth year of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar's second year as king, Daniel is elevated to his right hand. Now, that's real important. Daniel is at Nebuchadnezzar's right hand throughout this whole period. Every time Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem or sacks Jerusalem, Daniel's his right-hand man. So Daniel must have been real popular with the conservatives in Judah. I mean, this was the ultimate Quisling here. This guy's a Benedictine. He's in there helping Nebuchadnezzar conquer us over and over again. He's bringing in the United Nations troops on us. They're marshaling in Texas, and Daniel's there with them. So that would have been the way he was perceived. Make no mistake about it. This Daniel was hated big time. In fact, it's interesting that Ezekiel writes to the people of Judah, and he says, the three most righteous men who ever lived, Job, Noah, and Daniel, which must have not sat real well with people back in Judah. But at any rate, here Daniel was at the court, at the right hand of Nebuchadnezzar, and actually he'd gone to prepare a place for them, as we'll see as we study Daniel. Daniel was elevated in the 8th year of Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim revolts against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar is too busy to take him on till the 10th year. Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes Jerusalem again. In the 11th year, a year after that, Jehoiakim dies. Jehoiachin becomes king, and as soon as he becomes king, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, so Nebuchadnezzar has to take Jerusalem again. And at that time, Ezekiel and his friends are deported into captivity, along with Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin is taken into captivity, and Ezekiel and his friends go, and Zedekiah is left behind as king of Judah. 6 years later, in the 6th year of Zedekiah, Ezekiel sees God pack up and move out of the temple. He sees the abominations that are being committed, and he sees God leave the temple desolated. It's an important historical event. And he tells them, God has left. The temple is empty. Sure enough, 3 years later, Zedekiah revolts. 2 years after that, Jerusalem is sacked and burned. God had already left it. That's what counts. The fact that the building is burned up, that's just the aftermath. Well, in terms of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years. His son Adrammerodach succeeded him. He honored Jehoiachin. Apparently, as part of his accession year ceremonies, he elevated Jehoiachin and honored him at court. But he only reigned 2 years. And Neriglissar took over, and he reigned for 4 years, and then Nabonidus took over, and he reigned for 17 years. Now, Nabonidus was a little bit on the odd side. He was kind of like Akhenaten. He decided that he didn't really like the traditional Babylonian gods, like Akhenaten down in Egypt decided he was going to go off and worship Aton instead of Re, and made the Egyptians mad. Well, Nabonidus made the Babylonians mad because he went off to Tema in Saudi Arabia, and he stayed there for about 10 years. And he had his own gods and his own temple down there. And every year, the annual New Year's ceremony in Babylon would come, and there wouldn't be anything because the king wasn't there to head it up. He left Belshazzar back behind. Belshazzar was in charge during these years. So Nabonidus was very unpopular with the Babylonians, and so when Cyrus came to take the city, the Babylonians viewed him as a savior. And they opened the city to him. Belshazzar was killed that very night, and Cyrus took the kingdom. Then they began the Persian years. Cyrus was the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, I don't have this down here, but during the years that Babylon was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the 70 years, at the same time, I don't have a map here, but here's Judah, and here's Babylon, and off to the east was the big Median Empire, which the Bible doesn't say much about. The Medes had this big empire, and out here in the mountains south of Media was a bunch of wild men called Persians that didn't amount to anything. Well, during these Babylonian years of Nebuchadnezzar and Neriglissar and Nabonidus, the king of the Medes sent one daughter to marry Nebuchadnezzar, and he sent another daughter down here to marry into the Persians. And the Persians and the Medes got real close and cozy, and finally Cyrus conquered Media, kind of a friendly conquest. He kind of showed up and said to his uncle and grandfather Astyages, he said, "I'm here, surrender." And he said, "Okay, you can have this. I'm tired of running this Median empire. If you want it, it's yours." So he took over, and then he conquered Babylon. Now, I say this because in terms of history, there was a Median Empire before there was a Persian Empire, but there was no Median Empire between Babylon and Persia. There's no interval of time there. Liberals, and we'll see when we get into Daniel, they want to make it out that the first empire was Babylon, the second one was the Medes, and the third was the Persians, and the fourth was Greece. And the problem is there was no Median Empire in between. By the time Babylon fell, the Persians were in charge of the Medes. So it goes Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. That's the order. Well, Cyrus was very friendly to the Jews. In terms of the biblical pattern, he is David. His son, Prince Cambyses, was not favorable to the Jews, and he prevented the temple from being built. Once Darius came to the throne, he was friendly to the Jews. He is Solomon. As Ahasuerus, the great king, he marries Esther. That is the Song of Solomon for this period. Esther is like the Song of Solomon. Solomon marries her. Darius marries Esther. These things correspond. As Artaxerxes, which means great house, which is the same as the word Pharaoh, by the way. Pharaoh means great house. Artaxerxes apparently means great house. Darius had the temple and the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt. These are all the same guy. And the Bible history ends with him. After him comes Xerxes, which in Hebrew would be Ahasuerus, except he's not in the text. He comes next. Some would say that he's the great king who married Esther, but that's pretty unlikely given the genealogies. Darius is the one who married Esther. Xerxes invaded Greece, and he lost big time. After him comes Artaxerxes Longimanus, which means the long-handed. He had one hand longer than the other. He had a relatively quiet and long rule. He's often mistaken for the Artaxerxes in Ezra and Nehemiah, but again, the genealogies won't admit you to go down that far. All these kings were called Great King, Ahasuerus. They were all called Great House, Artaxerxes. And so, in the Bible, these guys are all Darius. I'm quite convinced. Then you have some other kings after that in Persia, and there's nothing distinguished about any of them, so we come to the Greek years. And this is all in Daniel 11, and we will look at it in detail. Basically, the history here is Alexander conquers the world. As soon as he conquers it, he dies. He doesn't have any children who inherit anything, so his generals divide up the kingdom into 4 kingdoms, north, south, east, and west. The Bible is concerned about the north and the south. The Greeks who ruled Egypt fought with the Greeks who ruled Syria. That's the north and the south. It's all over Daniel 11. And the reason they fought was because there was this area in between called Judea and all these other areas called Syria and other places that they wanted to be in charge of. And so they kept fighting over this territory. After a while, the Jews commit the abomination of desolation. Jason and Menelaus sell out the priesthood. They murder the high priest. God sends in Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria to punish them. At that time, the Maccabees take over the high priesthood. They drive out the Syrians, but they refuse to reinstate the true Zadokite priest. They institute their own line. The Maccabees make themselves high priests. These are called the Hasmoneans or Asmoneans because the Maccabee family name was Hashmon. And from that time on, they're the high priests. We have a succession of evil, violent, Hellenizing, apostate high priests. Matters get so bad that the priests are now fighting among themselves over who's going to be high priest, and they appeal to Antipater, king of Edom, to help. And when he can't help, they appeal to Pompey of Rome, and Pompey comes in and settles things, and Rome takes over. Rome installed Herod, an Edomite, as king of the Jews. That's important. Jesus is king of the Jews. The Gospels start off with Herod as king of the Jews. They end with Pilate saying Jesus is king of the Jews. It's very important to see these things next to each other. Herod, as king of the Jews, his rule was worse than all the bad Davidic kings put together. When we discuss Herod, we will see, and Herod does come up in Daniel, I'm quite convinced. Modern historians want to say, well, Herod wasn't all that bad. I mean, considering how the other kings of the ancient world were, Herod was just like all the rest of them. But the problem is, you've got to measure Herod by the standards of the Davidic kings, because that's what he claimed to be in line with. And measured by that standard, he was a monster. He may not have been any worse than Nero, but he sure was a whole lot worse than anything in the Bible. And during his reign, the remaining Greek power, we come to the end of the Greek period, Cleopatra VII, who is the Cleopatra, she is destroyed, and that's the end of Greece. Now Rome stands clear. At the end of Herod, who is a new Saul, the new David is born, and the work of Christ brings the imperial restoration era to an end. To an end. And that's an overview of the history. And what we'll be looking at in Zechariah and Daniel is the prophecies of these events, and then we'll look at the fulfillment and learn more about this history. We'll find an occasion where one of these kings got so mad at the believers who had rebelled against him that he took 800 of the leaders of the righteous believers, and he had them crucified while he and his concubines and his friends had a dinner party. And while the believers were crucified and dying during this dinner party, this king brought in all their wives and children and had them slaughtered while the men on the crosses watched. And that wasn't Nero. That was the high priest of Israel, Alexander Jannaeus, who did that. Now that gives you a picture of what happened to the high priesthood during this period. Okay, that's the survey, and our time's up.